latest major protest against plans to house hundreds of asylum seekers at a military base.
Across the country, tensions are rising. Protests are growing in size. Public disorder incidents are increasing, and confidence in government is clearly under pressure. These crowds are no longer just voicing concerns. They believe they are no longer being heard. And that shift from frustration to action is where things begin to change. At the centre of the storm is a government plan to expand the use of temporary accommodation sites, including former military bases, to manage rising pressure on housing systems. Ministers describe it as a practical response to overcrowded hotels. Critics see it differently. They argue the policy signals a system under strain and raises serious questions about long-term planning, capacity, and community impact. Numbers vary depending on the source, and that uncertainty has only added fuel to the debate. Then came the moment that shifted everything. A training facility was repurposed to support accommodation needs, a decision that quickly became symbolic. For many, it wasn't just about one site. It was about priorities. Within hours, protests intensified. Clashes were reported in some areas. Police vehicles were damaged. And in a matter of minutes, what had been a political issue became a public order challenge. What started in isolated locations quickly spread. Reports of pressure on accommodation systems, particularly hotels, became a national talking point. For critics, the contrast was stark. They pointed to broader housing challenges, including homelessness and veteran support, and asked whether resources were being allocated fairly. Meanwhile, the government maintained that emergency measures were necessary to manage demand. Within hours, demonstrations appeared across multiple cities. From London to Belfast, crowds gathered to express frustration with immigration policy, public spending, and government transparency. Some called for reform. Others demanded accountability. A small number of arrests were made, but the scale of the unrest suggested this was only the beginning. As the situation intensified, some protests turned confrontational. Projectiles were thrown. Police lines were tested. Emergency services were deployed to contain the situation. Authorities responded with riot control measures and reinforced key locations. The message was clear. The situation was being taken seriously. Away from the protests, another story was unfolding. Local communities began raising concerns about pressure on services, changes in neighbourhood dynamics, and the overall pace of policy decisions. These concerns varied widely, but they shared a common theme. People wanted clarity and reassurance. Economic effects were also being reported. Property markets in some areas showed signs of uncertainty. Local businesses expressed concern about disruption, and councils warned about the strain on infrastructure. Whether temporary or long-term, the financial impact became part of the wider debate. By evening, the human cost became visible. Injuries were reported on both sides, protesters and police, and alongside the physical impact came a wave of political accusations. Some protesters claimed unequal enforcement. Authorities rejected those claims, insisting that law and order were being applied consistently. In certain areas, police operations were stretched. Command units coordinated responses across multiple locations. Reinforcements were deployed where needed, and officers worked to prevent further escalation. Maintaining control without inflaming tensions became a delicate balance. Meanwhile, online speculation surged. Claims about internal plans, strategies, and long-term intentions circulated rapidly. Some were based on partial information. Others remained unverified. But in the digital age, perception can move faster than fact, and once narratives take hold, they are difficult to reverse. As pressure mounted, calls for accountability grew louder. Critics demanded policy changes. Supporters defended the government's approach as necessary and legally grounded. The Prime Minister maintained that decisions were being made in the national interest and warned that disorder would not dictate policy. Public opinion became increasingly polarised. Some believed strong enforcement was overdue. Others argued the system must remain humane and legally sound. The country was not just debating policy. It was debating identity, values and direction. Behind the politics, infrastructure pressures were becoming more visible. Housing capacity, public services, local authority budgets, all under strain. Officials acknowledged the challenges, but insisted systems were still functioning. Critics weren't convinced. Beyond the immediate crisis lies a bigger question. What is the long-term plan? How will housing, migration and community integration be managed over the next decade? These are not short-term decisions. They shape the future of the country. Perhaps the most significant impact has been on trust. Trust between communities, trust in institutions, trust in leadership. Once shaken, trust is difficult to rebuild, and it often matters more than policy itself. Businesses are watching closely. Investors are cautious. Local economies are adjusting to uncertainty. Tourism, trade, and everyday commerce all feel the ripple effects of instability. And while some impacts may fade, others could last much longer. What began as a policy decision has become something far bigger, a national debate, a political test, a moment of reckoning. Because at its core, this is not just about immigration, it is about governance, about trust, and about whether a modern state can manage complex challenges while keeping its people united. The outcome is still uncertain, but one thing is clear: the conversation is no longer confined to Parliament. It is happening across the entire country, and it is far from over. Inside government, the pressure is mounting. Every decision is now under a microscope. Every statement is analysed. Every delay is interpreted. Because moments like this don't just test policy, they test leadership. Can the government project control without escalating tensions? Can it enforce the law without deepening division? Can it explain its strategy clearly enough to regain public trust? These are not simple tasks. And in the middle of a rapidly evolving situation, there are no easy answers. For the opposition, this is a defining moment, an opportunity to challenge, to question, to present alternatives, but also a risk, because criticism alone is not enough. The public wants solutions, clear ones, workable ones, and politically, this is where many debates falter. It is easy to point out problems, much harder to fix them. At the centre of everything lies the law. Immigration policy doesn't operate in a vacuum. It is bound by legal frameworks, by international agreements, by court oversight. And that creates a tension, because what some people demand politically is not always possible legally. And what is legally required is not always politically popular. That gap between law and expectation is where frustration grows. Amid all the politics, there is something easy to forget: the human side.
Now,
behind every policy, there are real people, communities trying to adapt, families concerned about their future, individuals navigating complex systems. And while political debates reduce everything to numbers and strategy, the reality is far more personal. That doesn't make the policy questions easier, but it does make them more complicated. Running beneath the entire situation is something less visible, but equally powerful. Economics, housing costs, public spending, local budgets, all of it connected. Because when systems come under pressure, it's not just about policy decisions, it's about resources. What can be funded, what cannot, and who feels the impact first. That's why debates like this rarely stay confined to one issue. They expand, they connect, they evolve into something bigger. Right now, Britain is watching itself through screens, through headlines, through debates that feel increasingly intense. And in moments like this, countries often ask the same questions. Who are we? What do we prioritise? And how do we move forward without breaking apart? There are no quick answers, only competing visions. So what happens next? The protests may calm, or they may grow. Policies may change, or they may hold firm. But one thing is certain, this moment will leave a mark on politics, on public trust, on how future decisions are made. Because once a system is questioned at this level, it doesn't return to normal overnight. This was never just about one policy or one protest or one set of numbers. It became something larger, a test of governance, a test of communication, and a test of whether a country can navigate disagreement without losing cohesion. Because in the end, the real challenge isn't managing a crisis. It's what comes after. And that is where this story leaves us. Not with a conclusion, but with a question. Has this been a temporary surge of tension or the beginning of something much deeper? Only time will answer that.